What if you had taken a different turn this morning? Or, what if you'd made a totally different decision about that big project at work? We think about these alternative realities all the time, right? Things that aren't true, but could or would have been. So today we're taking a deep dive into the fascinating world of counterfactuals. Those what-if statements that, well, they just permeate our thoughts, our language, even how scientists reason. Our compass for this deep dive is an incredible source, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on counterfactuals, and our mission. It's to unpack what they are, why they're so deeply important across so many fields, and, crucially, how thinkers are trying to understand their very meaning.
Yeah, and what's truly mind-bending here is just how deeply embedded counterfactuals are. I mean, in nearly every aspect of our existence, from how we make moral choices to how artificial intelligence learns.
Right.
They're not just some, philosophical curiosity. They're more like a fundamental blueprint for how we think about what could be.
That's a fascinating scope psychology AI. So for you, our listener, where do these what-if statements first sort of pop up in a way we'd recognize? Well, like when we say things like, what if Martin Luther King had died when he was stabbed back in 1958? Or, what if the Americas had never been colonized? That's exactly this kind of thinking.
Exactly. And it's important to clarify something here. While we're using counterfactual pretty broadly for these what-if statements, the source points out that in philosophical literature, you'll often see counterfactual, conditional, and subjunctive conditional used almost interchangeably.
Okay.
And this is true even if the antecedent, that's the if part, isn't actually false, contrary to fact. Like, if there had been intensive agriculture in the pre-Columbian Americas, the natural environment would have been impacted in specific ways. Now, that if statement, it might actually turn out to be true, not contrary to fact at all.
Right. So it's not always contrary to fact, even though we call them counterfactual sometimes.
Precisely.
So we're talking about what-if statements. But the source makes this interesting distinction between subjunctive conditionals and everyday indicative ones. What's the real difference there? Why does it matter so much?
Oh, it matters a lot because they behave, well, fundamentally differently. Consider this pair of statements about historical events. First, the indicative. If Oswald didn't kill Kennedy, someone else did.
Nope.
Now compare it to the subjunctive. If Oswald hadn't killed Kennedy, someone else would have.
Yeah, they feel different.
Right. The source explains you can easily imagine a world where the indicative is true. Maybe, some other lone fanatic actually killed Kennedy instead.
Right.
But in that same world, the subjunctive, someone else would, well, that doesn't necessarily hold true. The would have been outcome is different. It implies a kind of inevitability, maybe.
Okay, that makes sense. And here's another great example from the source that really highlights this distinction. It says you can perfectly normally say, Bob never danced. If Bob had danced, Leland would have danced. That's a classic subjunctive. Sounds fine.
Yeah, totally normal.
But try saying the indicative version. Hashtag Bob never danced. If Bob danced, Leland danced.
Yeah.
It just sounds weird, completely off when you've just denied the if part.
Exactly. The indicative clashes when the premise is false like that. And you'll also notice the linguistic differences, the grammar. Indicative conditionals often use simple past tense verbs like, if Bob danced, Leland danced. But subjunctives tend to use the past perfect that had VE form and a modal verb like would. So if Bob had danced, Leland would have danced.
Okay, so these what-if statements, they're clearly more intricate than they appear on the surface. But where it gets really interesting, you were saying, is their influence. It stretches far beyond just grammar.
Oh, absolutely.
Yep.
Far beyond. They're central to some of the deepest questions about ourselves and the world. Think about human agency and free will.
Right.
The very idea that you have a choice implies that when you pick option A, you could have chosen option B. That could have is pure counterfactual.
Oh, okay.
And this immediately leads us straight into the classic philosophical problem of free will. And how we define these counterfactuals, their semantics, can fundamentally impact the whole range of possible solutions.
It's surprising, isn't it? I saw the source mention psychological experiments suggesting that our belief in free will is actually linked to more counterfactual thinking.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Our ability to reflect on past events, past choices, to imagine alternative outcomes. It's not just like idle daydreaming. It's a significant way humans give meaning to life experiences, create a sense of self.
It really is. Some even argue it might be kind of pragmatic reason to believe in free will simply because thinking that way seems beneficial.
Interesting.
And beyond just meaning-making, this counterfactual reflection is a crucial part of what's called rational imagination.
Rational imagination.
Okay, think about it. A pilot analyzing a near accident,
Right.
right? Or a blackjack player reviewing a hand they lost. They're both using, if I had done X, then Y would have happened to formulate plans, improve future performance.
Learning from mistakes,
Yeah.
essentially.
Exactly, and studies show people who engage in this kind of thinking tend to show more persistence, more improvement over time.
But conversely, it's a sobering thought that when this kind of thinking goes astray, it can actually lead to, well, disordered rationality. Things like depression, anxiety, even schizophrenia.
That's right. The patterns of what-if thinking can become distorted or maladaptive. And interestingly, researchers in artificial intelligence voice very similar ideas.
How so?
Well, take causal decision theory. It argues that counterfactual reasoning is absolutely essential for rational decision-making, especially in complex scenarios. It even helps address classic paradoxes like Newcomb's problem, which really challenges standard ideas of just maximizing expected utility.
Right. Newsom's problem. That's a whole other deep dive.
It is. But the point is, this ability to reason about what would have happened if a different choice were made is seen as vital for any intelligent agent, biological or artificial.
And it gets even more foundational than that. The source mentions encoding relationships that support these what-if statements as a major theory of mental representation itself.
Yeah, how does your mind even represent a concept like dog in a way that reliably connects to actual dogs?
How does it?
Well, that's where tools like Bayesian networks and structural equations from AI become incredibly useful. These models, they represent an agent's knowledge by putting counterfactuals and causal connections right at their core.
So they're not just theoretical.
Not at all. They're applied in everything from autonomous vehicles to explaining cognitive phenomena like causal learning, counterfactual reasoning itself, action planning. The fundamental way agents learn and make decisions in an uncertain world seems to rely on these kinds of structures.
The source even had that example about tree rings carrying information about the tree's age. It wasn't just age causes rings, but something more counterfactual.
Exactly. Instead of just saying age causes the rings, some theories explain it using counterfactuals. The state of the tree rings carries the information that the tree is a certain age. Because if the tree rings were different, the tree would have to have been a different age. It's about what would be if things were otherwise.
Okay, connecting information to counterfactual possibilities.
Right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, counterfactuals are also used to analyze causation itself. The basic intuitive idea is a caused C can often be understood as if A had not occurred, C would not have occurred.
The but-for cause.
Precisely. And these what-if questions are also central to understanding scientific explanation and laws of nature. Here's a surprising insight. Laws of nature are seen as crucially different from just like accidental generalizations because they support counterfactuals.
That's a fascinating distinction. Can you give that example again, the gold one?
Sure. The law, all gold is malleable, clearly implies if that piece of metal were gold, it would be malleable, even if it's not gold.
Right. The law supports the what-if.
But take an accidental generalization, like the source's example. Every Canadian parent of quintuplets in the first half of the 20th century is named Diane. That was true, just by chance.
Okay.
But it does not imply if Jones, who is Canadian, had been a parent of quintuplets back then, he would have been named Diane. That's obviously absurd.
Yeah, clearly. That really shows the difference.
Yeah.
Laws support what-ifs, coincidences don't.
Exactly. It's a deep point about what makes something a law.
Okay, so we know counterfactuals are vital, they're everywhere. But understanding their semantics, how they systematically express truth about the world, turns out to be incredibly difficult. And here's where the profound puzzles for philosophers, logicians, AI researchers, where they really begin.
And here's where it gets really wild for traditional logic. The source explains that counterfactuals are not truth functional.
Not truth functional. What does that mean exactly?
It means you can't determine if a counterfactual statement is true just by knowing whether its parts, the if part, the antecedent, and the then part, the consequent, are true or false individually.
Wait, so unlike a simple if P then Q, in basic logic, you can't just look at the truth values of P and Q and know the truth value of if P had been true, Q would have been true.
Exactly. That's the problem.
Why is that such a huge hurdle?
Well, take the Janis Joplin example from the source. If Janis Joplin were alive today, she would drive a Mercedes-Benz. That feels, well, probably false, right?
Yeah, seems unlikely.
Now compare it to, if Janis Joplin were alive today, she would metabolize food. That feels clearly true.
Definitely true. She'd have to eat.
Right. But in both cases, the antecedent, if Janis Joplin were alive today, is false. And the consequence, she would drive a Mercedes-Benz, she would metabolize food, are also technically false right now because she's not alive.
Okay. Same truth values for the parts.
But one whole statement is clearly false, the other clearly true. Classical logic, which just relies on those simple true-false values for the parts, it just can't handle this nuance. It breaks down.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to wrap your head around. So if these statements defy simple truth and falsehood logic, what did philosophers do? Especially when they ran into those really confusing what-if statements, like the ones the philosopher Quine brought up.
Right, Quine. He posed these really puzzling pairs that made him seriously question if counterfactuals even make objective true or false claims about the world at all.
What were his examples again?
He famously asked us to consider things like, if Caesar had been in charge in Korea, he would have used the atom bomb, versus if Caesar had been in charge in Korea, he would have used catapults.
Hard to say.
Or if Bizet and Verdi had been compatriots, Bizet would have been Italian versus Verdi would have been French.
Again, who knows?
Exactly. These kinds of examples where your intuition gives differing answers or no clear answer, but the logical structure looks similar, led Quine to suggest that maybe it wasn't about the world's objective truth. Maybe it was more about the speaker's imagination or, what background assumptions they happen to have in mind.
So how can we possibly assign truth conditions, figure out if they're true or false, given these kinds of ambiguities? It sounds like a total minefield.
It is. But a giant in this field, David Lewis, he took these examples not as a reason to give up, but actually as evidence that counterfactuals are deeply context-sensitive.
Context-sensitive, okay.
The specific context, including, the speaker's intentions or what background facts we're implicitly holding fixed, constrains the possibilities we consider. We don't consider all possibilities, just the relevant ones given the conversation.
Right.
And this idea that context matters hugely is now pretty much fundamental to all contemporary attempts to understand counterfactuals.
That makes a lot of sense, grounding it in context.
Yeah.
But even with context, it sounds like there's still some really tricky logical cases, aren't there?
Yeah.
The source points to another profound puzzle called non-monotonicity. What's that about?
Non-monotonicity, yeah, this is a big one. It describes a situation where adding more information to the if part of a counterfactual can actually reverse its truth value.
So adding information makes it false when it was true before, or vice versa.
Exactly. It's like adding a new piece of information suddenly changes what you intuitively think would have happened. The classic example is about striking a match.
Okay.
If I had struck this match, it would have lit. Okay, that might seem true, assuming it's a normal match, oxygen, etc.
Yeah, sounds reasonable.
But then, suppose you add more information. If I had struck this match and done so in a room without oxygen, it would have lit.
Clearly false.
Right. The simple addition of one relevant fact completely flips the truth. Standard logic doesn't usually work like that. If something follows from P, it should also follow from P and Q, but not with counterfactual.
And the source shows how this non-monotonic property can be incredibly challenging, even with these things called Sobel sequences, where adding details repeatedly flips the truth back and forth.
Yeah, Lewis highlighted those. You can construct these sequences like, if I had shirked my duty, no harm would have ensued. Maybe true in some simple case. Then, though, if I had shirked my duty and you had too, harm would have ensued. Adding your shirking changes the outcome.
Right, makes sense.
Then maybe. But if I had shirked my duty and you had too, and our supervisor had noticed, then no harm would have ensued because we'd be stopped. You see, it can flip back and forth.
Wow. Okay, that ability to flip-flop based on added context is a defining challenge for any theory trying to explain these things.
Absolutely. And finally, the philosopher Goodman posed another really profound challenge. The problem of, circularity or maybe background conditions.
Circularity? How so?
Well, think about that match example again. If I had struck this match, it would have lit. For that to be true, you need to implicitly assume a huge set of background conditions are met. Right?
Yeah, like the match is dry, there's oxygen.
But exactly. Oxygen present, the wind is below a certain threshold, there's sufficient friction, the match isn't defective, and so on and so on.
A whole list.
A potentially infinite list. The problem is, how do you specify all those relevant background conditions? And worse, many of those conditions often seem to be expressible themselves as counterfactuals. For example, if there hadn't been oxygen, it wouldn't have lit. Or they rely on laws of nature, which, as we saw, are often defined by their ability to support counterfactuals.
Ah, so you end up defining counterfactuals in terms of things that seem to depend on counterfactuals.
That's the worry. It looks potentially circular. How do you break into that circle to give a non-counterfactual definition of counterfactuals? Goodman thought this was a massive, perhaps insurmountable problem.
Okay, so these things are really slippery. They defy simple logic, they're context-dependent, they flip-flop with more info, and defining them seems circular. So how did philosophers, faced with these mind-bending puzzles, actually try to pin down their logic? This is where our deep dive plunges into the formal models, right? Specifically, the strict conditional analysis and the similarity analysis.
That's right. They turn to formal logic, often using the idea of possible worlds, which are basically just complete ways the world could be or could have been.
Possible worlds.
The core idea for both approaches is to evaluate if a statement like, if A had happened, C would have happened, is true by looking at certain possible worlds. Sometimes these worlds are constrained by what are called accessibility spheres, basically, sets of worlds considered relevant or possible from our actual world or from a given context.
So the strict analysis, that one sounds stricter. How does it work?
It's perhaps the simplest formal approach, at least initially. It says, if it had been A, it would have been C is true if and only if, in all the relevant or accessible possible worlds where A is true, C is also true.
All accessible A worlds or C worlds? Seems straightforward enough.
It seems straightforward, but it runs into a big problem pretty quickly, especially with that non-monotonicity we talked about. It validates logical inferences that just feel wrong for counterfactuals. Well, it implies a pattern called antecedent monotonicity, or strengthening the antecedent. Basically, if A, then C is true, then if A and B, then C should also be true according to strict analysis.
Okay.
But remember the match. If I struck it, it would light might be true. But if I struck it and there's no oxygen, it would light is false. The strict analysis struggles to block that kind of inference naturally. Or take the sources Hoover example, maybe. If J. Edgar Hoover were today a communist, then he would be a traitor. It's true, given his historical context.
Plausible, yeah.
The strict analysis then seems to imply if J. Edgar Hoover had been born a Russian and were today a communist, he would be a traitor, is also true, which feels weird. Being born Russian doesn't automatically make you a U.S. traitor in the same way. It validates patterns that don't quite fit our what-if intuitions.
Right, so it struggles with that context-shifting, information-adding aspect.
Yeah.
But you mentioned don't count it out entirely. There's a second wave.
Exactly. More recent defenders of strict analysis argue that the non-monotonic behavior we see isn't really a flaw in the logic of the counterfactual itself. Instead, they argue it's about how our conversational context shifts, changing which worlds count as accessible as we add information.
Ah, so the logic is simple, but the context is doing the heavy lifting.
That's the idea. They try to explain away many of the tricky counterexamples by saying we're subtly equivocating context. We're implicitly changing the set of relevant worlds when we add information like, and there's no oxygen. It's a clever defense, though still debated.
Okay, so what's the main alternative? The similarity analysis.
Right. This is probably the most famous approach, especially associated with David Lewis and also Robert Solnacre. It explicitly rejects that strict antecedent monotonicity pattern.
Why does it do that?
By using a graded notion, not just accessible or not. It says, if it had been A, it would have been C is true if and only if all the A worlds that are most similar to our actual world are also C worlds.
Most similar. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's not all accessible A worlds, just the closest ones.
Exactly. It focuses on the possible worlds where the if part A is true, but which otherwise differ minimally from our actual world. This allows the set of most similar worlds to change depending on what A is. So the worlds most similar to ours where I strike the match might not include worlds without oxygen, allowing the first counterfactual to be true. But the worlds most similar where I strike it and there's no oxygen are obviously different, explaining why the second is false.
Okay, so instead of just accessible worlds, the similarity analysis asks, which possible what-if worlds are closest or least different from our own in the most important ways?
Precisely. That's the core idea. Of course, defining similarity is the next big challenge, but the logical structure itself handles non-monotonicity much more naturally.
And the source mentioned there are ongoing debates even within these similarity theories. Are specific logical patterns.
Oh yeah, the debates get very technical, looking at things like whether If A or B then C implies if A then C, called simplification of disjunctive antecedents or SDA, or patterns like import-export. Different versions of similarity semantics give different answers. The crucial point, though, is that neither the strict nor the similarity analysis has definitively won the logic debate. Both have strengths and weaknesses when you test them against all our intuitions.
Okay, so the pure logic is still debated. But even if we could perfectly settle the logical rules, you mentioned both strict and similarity analyses face an even bigger, maybe more practical problem.
Yes, exactly. How do we specify which similarity relation or which accessibility sphere is the right one for any given counterfactual in a specific context? How do we actually use these theories to tell if a statement like, if my computer were off right now, the screen would be blank is true? What counts as the most similar world where my computer is off?
Right. How do we measure similarity between worlds? That sounds hard.
It's incredibly hard. Lewis himself, the main proponent of similarity semantics, tried to answer this with his famous system of weights or priorities for judging similarity.
A system of weights, what did that involve?
He proposed a kind of hierarchy, roughly. 1, it's most important to avoid big miracles' widespread violations of the actual laws of nature. Keep the laws the same if possible. 2, it's next most important to maximize the spatiotemporal region where the what-if world perfectly matches our actual world's history, especially before the if event happens. 3, it's less important, but still important, to avoid little miracles, small, localized violations of law, maybe just enough to make the if part happen. 4, it's of minor importance just to get approximate similarity of particular facts beyond the big region of perfect match.
Wow, okay. That's quite a detailed hierarchy. Avoid big miracles, maximize match, avoid small miracles. Did it work?
It worked for many cases, especially involving physical laws. But even Lewis's ingenious system ran into problems, particularly with counterfactuals involving chance or indeterminism.
Like what?
The source gives a classic example. If Nixon had pressed the button to launch nukes, the missiles would have launched. Intuitively, that seems true, holding the world's causal mechanisms fixed. But Lewis's system, prioritizing avoiding even small miracles, like the button mechanism failing randomly, sometimes gave the wrong answer, suggesting the most similar world might be one where a tiny miracle prevents the launch. Or consider the coin toss. If you had bet heads on this fair coin toss that actually came up tails, you would have won.
No, I would have lost because it came up tails.
Exactly. Our intuition holds the actual outcome of the chancy event fixed. But Lewis's system, prioritizing laws and maximizing spatiotemporal match before the bet, seemed to struggle. It wasn't clear why similarity should work that way for chance events. Lewis himself famously admitted about these kinds of cases, "I wish I knew why they came out differently." His elegant theory didn't quite capture all our everyday intuitions.
So the definition of similarity was the real Achilles heel.
It led to some serious philosophical objections, yeah. Critics argued Lewis's system felt ad hoc or reverse engineered, like it was designed just to get the answers he wanted, rather than truly explaining why counterfactuals are true or false.
Right.
Others raised broader concerns. Why would humans have evolved such a complex, baroque notion of counterfactual dependence based on minimizing miracles? And some pointed out, quite sharply, that science has no truck with the notion of similarity. Scientists build causal models, not similarity rankings of worlds.
That's a fair point. And the source mentioned something really mind-bending, using Arrow's theorem from economics about aggregating similarity.
Yeah, that's a fascinating formal argument. Arrow's theorem deals with the impossibility of combining individual preference rankings into a perfect group ranking under certain fairness conditions. The argument, adapted to this context, suggests that if there are multiple distinct dimensions of similarity between worlds, match of laws, match of facts, etc., it might be mathematically impossible to aggregate all these different respects of similarity and difference into a single, consistent, well-behaved notion of overall similarity that works for all counterfactuals.
Whoa. So the very idea of overall similarity might be flawed.
It raises a deep question. Is similarity between entire possible worlds even the right fundamental tool for the job, if it's so hard to define, weigh, and aggregate consistently?
Okay, so if similarity is maybe not the right tool, or at least deeply problematic, where does that leave us? This brings us to the more recent, and you said highly promising, alternative semantic analyses. Premise semantics and those using Bayesian networks, structural equations, and causal models.
Exactly. These accounts are often seen as the cutting edge, and they try to make more concrete predictions by focusing more directly on relations between facts or variables within a model, rather than just this abstract notion of similarity between entire possible worlds.
Okay, so tell me about premise semantics first.
Premise semantics, which actually has roots in Goodman's early work, proposes that evaluating a counterfactual involves explicitly adjusting a set of background premises or facts that we hold true.
How does that work?
So, when you consider, if it hadn't been raining, Jones would have been wearing his hat, you start with your set of beliefs about the actual situation. It is raining, Jones isn't wearing his hat, Jones wears his hat only when it's not raining, etc. Then you mentally retract the premise, it is raining. Then you see what other facts logically follow or need to be adjusted to maintain consistency, given that retraction and the other background rules or dependencies you accept, like the rule about Jones's hat wearing.
Ah, okay. So you tweak your premises and see what follows. Does that work better?
For some key cases, yes. The source shows how premise semantics can correctly predict the intuitive falsity of that Jones's hat example, because removing raining forces you to add Jones wears hat. And it can even handle the truth of the coin toss example, if you'd bet heads you would have lost, more naturally than Lewis did, by holding the actual outcome premise fixed unless forced to change it. It offers a more intuitive way to characterize how context influences our interpretation by focusing on which background facts we keep or discard.
That sounds promising. But is it perfect?
Not quite. Even premise semantics has encountered its own tricky counterexamples. The source mentions a complex light switch scenario involving multiple switches and relays. In some versions, standard premise semantics might incorrectly allow the removal of a background fact that doesn't actually depend causally on the switch being down, leading to the wrong prediction about whether the light would be on.
Okay.
It highlighted the need for a more robust, perhaps more explicitly causal concept of dependence between facts beyond just logical consistency.
And this is where the Bayesian networks, structural equations, and causal models come in. They focus explicitly on causality.
Exactly. This is where a lot of exciting work is happening now, often bridging philosophy, AI, and cognitive science. The core idea, often called interventionism, most associated with Judea-Pearl, evaluates a counterfactual like if switch B had been up, the light would have been on in a very different way.
No.
Instead of comparing whole worlds, it uses a causal model, often represented as a directed graph showing which variables influence which others. To evaluate the counterfactual, you imagine performing a surgical intervention on the model.
An intervention, like messing with the model.
Sort of. You metaphorically reach into the model, cut off any existing causal arrows pointing into the variable you're changing, switch B, force that variable to take on the counterfactual value, and then you let that change propagate forward through the network according to the existing causal links to see what the downstream effects are, like on the light variable. It's like running a controlled experiment within the causal model.
Okay, so you sever incoming causes, set the value, and see what happens next in the causal chain.
Precisely. Pearl himself contrasts this sharply with Lewis. He says something like, Lewis's elusive miracles are replaced by principled, mathematically defined interventions. Similarities and priorities are not basic to the analysis. It grounds counterfactuals directly in the causal mechanisms that we believe produce the phenomena, not in some vague notion of overall world similarity.
And why is this approach seen as so powerful?
Well, for several reasons. First, it directly addresses Goodman's circularity problem and the objections to similarity by grounding counterfactuals in a concept causality that is already central to how we understand mental representation, rational agency, and scientific explanation anyway. It feels less ad hoc.
Right. It connects better to other things we care about.
Second, it often makes very clear, testable predictions. And importantly, it directly predicts the intuitively correct outcome in that tricky light switch example that stumped standard premise semantics, because it correctly tracks the causal dependencies. It seems to capture our causal intuitions about what-ifs very well.
So it handles the tricky cases better and feels more scientifically grounded.
In many ways, yes. However, it's not a final silver bullet either. Interventionism, especially in its basic forms, still faces its own counterexamples and challenges. Things like complex embedded counterfactuals, if A had happened, then if B had happened, C would have happened, can be tricky. Or situations involving, say, common causes like a cannon firing causes both a flash and a bang slightly later. Reasoning counterfactually about the bang, if the flash hadn't happened, requires careful handling of the common cause structure.
Okay, so it's still work in progress.
Definitely. This is a really rapidly developing area of research. New versions of causal modeling approaches are constantly emerging, often driven by trying to better match experimental data on how humans actually perform counterfactual reasoning. It's a very active field.
Wow. What an incredible journey we've taken. Seriously, from the simple what if that we all think every day to these really complex philosophical, logical, and even computational depths of counterfactuals.
It really covers a huge amount of ground.
We've seen how they're tangled up with our sense of free will, how we make rational decisions, how our minds might represent the world, and even our fundamental understanding of cause and effect and the very laws of nature. It's pretty mind-blowing.
It really is. And the debate, as we saw among the strict analyses, the similarity analyses, and now these structural equation or causal model analyses, it's fierce and very much ongoing. While similarity theories, especially Lewis's, really dominated philosophy for decades, these structural equation analyses are gaining significant traction now. They integrate so elegantly with broader scientific and cognitive models, which gives them a lot of appeal.
So the next time you, our listener, catch yourself thinking, what if? Maybe consider not just the endless alternative possibilities out there, but also the profound, complex machinery of thought, language, and maybe reality itself that allows you to even ask that question. And here's a final thought to chew on. What if understanding counterfactuals, really getting a grip on how they work, isn't just a philosophical puzzle, but maybe the key to unlocking even deeper insights into the nature of intelligence itself, both human and artificial?